So I posted the agenda into the chat window. Still have to wait a little bit. John is not here yet, but I see Rich, Neil, Eduardo, hey Dick, Cedric, Carsten, and Mitya. Thanks for joining today as well.
Hi, thank you.
I expect somewhat light attendance today, given that there is the public holiday in the US tomorrow. So let's see.
Well, Hannes, have we reached a conclusion on the hackathon? What we want to show there?
Well, I would say so, but we should definitely rehash this to make sure that we are all on the same page. Hackathon is getting closer, so we need to obviously start to get our act together.
Sounds good. Thank you.
I was planning to respond to one of the emails that you sent around with some other folks from the Federal Drug Administration. I think they were. So.
Yeah, when I reached out to Jessica Wilkerson, really just looking for validation if what we were thinking about for our hackathon was even, practical with regard to what they're trying to do with their new rules. And that's all I'm really hoping we can do is get some sense of validation that we're at least in the ballpark.
Yeah.
And certainly no commitments because they just don't do that. The government has to go through all kinds of long processes before they'll commit to anything.
Yeah, I don't expect them to participate because I could imagine that there are all sorts of barriers they would have to go through. They would probably need to announce that, well, let's say 6 months ahead of time to get through all the bureaucratic stuff. But yeah.
Yeah, I don't think. Yeah, I don't think we need their approval to do what we want to do, which is really just pull down some evidence data. But I would hope that they would want to, look at what we accomplish in that and see if there's something that they can
definitely
use.
I hope so. Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool. Hey, John. So I will do the meeting minute taking again. Mitya, since you joined today and we had an off-list sort of introduction and email exchange, do you want to briefly introduce yourself? Would that be okay for you?
Sure, absolutely. So I'm a co-founder of Gosh, which is a project that doing concentrating on securing software supply chain, among other things. Beforehand, I was a CTO and chief architect of Everscale blockchain, where I worked on node development, consensus protocol, research, and some other things. Beforehand, I was working on Ethereum blockchain mostly, like several projects. And basically I go 25 years back in the started from voice over IP back in 2000 and what it was 95. Yeah, so that's about me, more or less.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Yeah, Steve, who doesn't seem to be on the call today yet, introduced to each other because of your company. So it's always good to know all the different parties sort of working on this supply chain security topic, essentially. Good. I don't know how familiar you are with the Meet Echo and with the IETF process. I'm happy to sort of give you a separate intro into that.
Last time I was involved in the design of standards was around DOCSIS 2.0, which a long time ago for cable modem industry and voice over IP there. So we kind of proposed that most of the specifications for DOCSIS 2.0 and worked on that ITU-T kind of standard body, but not an IETF.
Okay. Yeah. yeah, it's a little different than IETF, but and also the tools are now different. But I think you will find your way into it pretty quickly. Cool. Yeah, thanks for joining anyway. So I posted the agenda to the list ahead of time, and I had 3 items. The first one was to basically wrapping up the discussion about the registration policy that we were talking about last time, and John sort of tried to create a PR, and he will talk about it in a few minutes. And then we also wanted to talk a little bit about the architectural boundaries, which is a topic we seem to still come across from time to time, almost at every meeting these days. So I think it's would be important to talk about this, and this is a little bit related also to the hackathon, I think. So we'll talk about hackathon stuff, and then we should maybe conclude with the key trends working group formation and see what a conversation status is, as they are currently doing going through an approval process of the charter there. I hope we will manage to go through these 3 items. Okay. Anyone else has some thoughts on the agenda, some agenda bashing that we need to do? Cedric, do you want to say something?
Yes, just as a comment, I think the one key transparency is quite urgent because they are voting right now. So I want to make sure we have time to discuss it today.
Okay, so maybe we then switch 3 and 2. Yeah, that's a good one.
Thanks.
Cool. Okay. John, do you want to start with explaining what your thoughts were on the registration policy PR and how the text could or should look like?
Yes, and happily we'll have plenty of time to talk about key trends because I don't think I'll take very long. I've predictably not got quite as far as I would hope, but I do have some notes which I'm trying to share if I can do that. Window.
As you are sort of putting that up on the screen, who is actually in charge of updating the architecture document? Or is that kind of a collective effort among all the authors?
It's a collective effort, Hannes.
Okay, that's good. That's good. Next Monday is the draft submission deadline.
Okay, add pressure. Why not you? Okay.
Yeah. No, it's not made up by myself, right? It's really next Monday.
I'm just bugging you.
That's fine. Cedric, you want to say something about that?
Yeah. So we have an editor, so it should be the one marshalling us there. But yes, we can work by that time.
Oh, you delegated. Very good.
No, we have. Yes.
Oh, I hope he knows. I will send him a message.
Please do. Yes, thanks.
John.
Okay, so I can't share my screen owing to system security preferences. So I'm going to post what I would be sharing on a PowerPoint into the notes. And if people want to see that, you can look at the notes. And if you don't, you can look at the notes later. Essentially, so I went through the doc, and we started looking at this because the topic of registration policies was starting to take quite a lot of time, and it was running into some also sort of derived issues of how we deal with identities of various different types of things in those registration policies, the security guarantees that they might offer, and even sort of application layer stuff like feed integrity and how you can restrict things like who can write to a software package as opposed to who can write to a SCITT artifact, which are all starting to get very sort of tentacly in terms of their technical implications. So I've been through the spec in all the places where registration policies and feeds are defined and used. And I haven't quite got as far as making a PR for it yet, although I'm close. But the sort of issues that I came to that have slowed me down a bit is that actually, if you look at the definitions of feed and registration policy on their own, they're pretty close to what we've been discussing. So question marks over violating the application layer, I think, are actually easy to deal with. We don't. Questions over whether we understand the semantic value of the payloads. Also, there's no requirement for us to do that, and there's also nothing in there that stops a system from doing things like the indexing we were talking about last week. So I think we're clean on that. The place where it gets difficult is that there are lots of references in other places to things like the registration policy, which seem to imply slightly different things, and so it's unfortunately slightly bigger surgery than I'd hoped to get it clean. But I think my overall impression is that actually the core bit of the spec is correct according to desires of what people wanted, and we just need to clean up the side references. So a few bits where
John,
I wanted to sort of, I'll make a few statements and then see if anybody has comments or questions on them. But the places in the core specification or definitions of these things that are still a bit tricky is that we do have this, I think, not quite finished idea of having sort of two-sided registration policies. So there's something that looks a lot like the server imposing access control, but there's also another dimension to that, which is not the sort of standard obvious access control, but also things like don't register this if it's more than a week old, or don't register this if it is sequentially earlier than something I already know. I don't personally have an issue with those things being possible, but they do make it more complicated. The place where I think it does need to be really simplified is that there's another dimension to it, which is the client expressing its thoughts on registration in a stronger way than just being a hint, such as a sequence number, and that I think needs to go. There's a very minor thing, but wanted to raise it anyway, that the spec mentions RBAC. I'm not quite sure why we mentioned RBAC. I think we should just say access control, because role-based is not the only fruit, and I don't think we should be very specific there, unless and until we specify something in the API spec itself. And there, I think we've got OIDC, so that's already taken care of with extended claims. And that's roughly it. So I see your hand, Cedric, but just
yeah. But before you go there, I just for the new participants, I hope everyone saw that I posted 2 links into the chat window. One was to the architecture document, which is what John was talking about, and the other one is the link to the meeting minutes, which is also in the panel at the top. And John posted some text with what he has just been talking about into that into the meeting minutes. Cedric.
Yeah, Cedric.
Yes, sorry, I didn't want to interrupt, but maybe I can already comment on these points and maybe restate some of the intent that I think are possibly leading to some confusion in the current writing. So, I think we all agree that we don't want we want to be very selective as to what registration policies we make normative. So we don't want to put too much pressure there. And I think right now we have mandatory registration policies about checking the signature and checking that the identity makes sense. And even that is going to depend on the DID method. And so I think these are important requirements, and we don't need to make many more registration policies mandatory. At the same time, I think that in almost all practical use of a SCITT for a given supply chain, there will be meaningful registration policies, and that being able to declare and enforce a registration policy at the transparency service is essential. And so because we think it's going to be quite specific to the supply chain, it's hard to do more than give explain that it's important and give some meaningful examples of policies you may apply, but not any more normative than that. So one of the other thing that was discussed at length in the discussion of registration policies, and that might explain some of the current writing, is that right now we are trying to avoid putting too much pressure on implementations, because some registration policies require keeping some auxiliary state or using more resources, and that's an even stronger reason not to make them mandatory. But as an example, if you want to check for secure version numbers, for example, then you need to be able to fetch what was at the transparency service, what was the last version number that was registered, and that's useful. But that's also quite hard to implement at scale. So that's another reason why we want to provide examples, but we don't want to be normative, because some things can be quite hard to implement in some settings. Regarding what the client does, I think the one provision we have is that there is a registration info header that is meant to provide the input to the registration policies. And again, we should not see that as demands or requests that the client is making, but more like providing input for the registration policies that may be specific to the supply chain. And so it's a place to pass arguments rather than, I think, a way to control what the policies are going to do. Although it can be used for that, but again, I see that as an example, not as something mandatory. Finally, I think airbag is an accident. Access control is good enough, so that's easy to fix. Does it make sense, John, or do you have a very different view on this?
No, I think it makes a lot of sense. I think an issue with a lot of us being time poor and having a lot of work to do, I want to clean up a bunch of the sections that are giving these examples, because it's good in a way that the text is not normative, but it's still text that's present, and it can be confusing. So I think I agree with everything you said. I think on as long as the registration info header is considered to be not security relevant as such, obviously it comes from a known person and you can believe that they said it, but otherwise, if we have a one-sided security protocol there, I'm happy with everything else. And I think I just want to make those examples, make it very clear that that's what we're doing. Otherwise that sounds good.
Maybe as a quick follow-up, I think in some cases it will be security critical, but we don't want to make it the security critical aspect will be mandatory. As a concrete example, if you have a secure version number in the registration info, then it is security critical for transparency service that are enforcing strict secure version number discipline. But and it won't be for transparency service that ignores it.
Yeah.
So where I'm hung up here, John, is that the configuration for the transparency service for types of identity that it will generate a receipt for is under the control of the transparency service itself. RBAC and storage and everything else that might be surrounding this is secondary to my concern. In fact, I don't even think it belongs in this conversation. It's just, I don't understand how to represent the identity configuration for the transparency service and how it changes and how do we track that. And I didn't quite get that from your text. And maybe that's a misunderstanding my point, sorry.
No, it was it's not a bit I've been looking at, because I was hoping to sort of remove a lot of the need for that. There's a whole other thing to look at, which I don't think I want to sort of pick up today, but just to say why I didn't pick it up in my last review, which is to define whether or not, and I would suggest not, but we can get around that, the signer of the signed statement and the issuer, to take this sort of middle name, and the entity that submits an API call into the transparency service, whether those are all the same identity and subject to the same identity management at the system level and registration policy at the registration level. And
that's fair. I kind of had a model in my head of transparency service being potentially similar to SMTP. It's basically, different identities or different bulk operations could be submitting content. It's actually the content itself identity that is interesting for the receipt generation.
Yes. So I think that's right, and that's where most of the effort has gone into the document, and that's where we have our issuer of the signed statement.
Correct, but what I don't understand is how to track whether an existing service configures a SIG store provider and then a DID web provider a week later, how we understand or how do we rationalize over the receipts generated based on time. Specifically, if you were to do an audit in a federation to archivist, let's say, and then somebody goes and changes the configuration to allow a different identity provider, how would you detect that? And that's always been why I focused on the wording here.
Okay, gotcha. So I'm glad you made that last point, because I was about to go down a long sort of zero trust certificate transparency kind of road. So the way, with my chair hat off for a second, the way we deal with that in Archivist is that every feed includes signed statements from the platform with an inclusion proof and a cryptographic proof of the new cryptographic group that has been created for the access control and management of that particular feed. So in our platform, we end up having the feed of all of the signed statements, including signed statements from the transparency service saying when it updates the policy. And there's a bunch of, there's caching and all sorts of other things to make that easier to audit. But fundamentally, if you're reconstructing from the Merkle tree inclusion proofs, that's the audit and the complete history that you get. So that's the sort of system level solution that we chose. I don't know if we need to go into the depths of specifying that as the way to do it, but I mentioned that largely to observe that it is possible to do that on top of the building blocks that SCITT specifies.
But let me double click on that. So would you believe then that the feed would change the same even though I enabled DID web or SIGSTOR or removed one of them?
This might be a thing we need to take to a more detailed offline conversation, because I think the change that you're suggesting, it would depend on how the enrollment of a user and the chaining up of their issuer identity, this actual key that does the content-based stuff I think we agreed on, it would depend how that is enrolled with the system. And I'm not sure off the top of my head I could come up with a complete normative model for that, but it is, I think sometimes it would matter and sometimes it wouldn't.
This is exactly the whole problem space where either we say, hey, we're not going to care about this, and you have to do a long form way to prove the identity provider, or you just validate the identity of the transparency service and say, hey, it proved that John signed this, not looking at who issued or what method John was used to generate his identity. I could definitely see that fast path being used if we're saying, hey, you should never do that, and you should always look at who the issuer is on top of. But that means every single endpoint, every customer needs to understand the same root trusts or configuration policy as the server. And that's why I was struggling to not do that, saying, hey, that basically, as long as you trust the transparency service, then you believe that the configuration for the system is the identity for John or Roy was exactly there. And that's why I get wrapped up on here. I'm thinking about the disconnected store and forward. If I just take the receipts off the curated feed, I don't have potentially some of this other data. And this is exactly why I was pushing on this problem space.
Right.
But
Sure.
none of that has to do with registration policies. That's, I think.
The registration policy, because we think it was registration for the transparency ledger, and it got rolled up into SCITT an application, and that was my problem. It's more of the identity configuration for the transparency ledger.
But I think we need to stay sort of precise on the specific functions, because we otherwise get lost in the functionality. We currently there's no text in there how federations work, even among SCITT servers, let alone interoperability into other ecosystems. I think that's a future problem.
We did talk about disconnected, right?
We talked about it, but it's not in the document.
You're being too nice here, Hans. Thank you.
I reread the document last week.
Thank you. I'll let somebody else go.
You let Steve know that he needs to add the text. Good.
So can I maybe comment on that? So I think
let me sort of, since I'm first in the queue, ask John, like, specifically, how should we change the text in the document? Because like, I put a proposal around that simplifies. I think we struggled with the same issues, but till next Monday, we need to come up with some text to make it better from where we are today. How do we get there?
So I think with the exception of a small change, I think I would make in light of what Roy's just said. I think I finally understand the root of that issue. I think your text works. I would still also want to make a change to relate it to feeds. This is the other thing that's a little bit unclear, is about the scope of registration policies. It sort of wanders a little bit to the reader between whether it applies to feeds or artifacts, which are sort of the same thing, but not quite exactly the same thing, or just to the whole transparency service. So there's a little bit extra to do, but
yeah, I didn't look into that at all.
I very much liked the tenor of that, and I think the conclusion last week was that we need to keep it real simple, and this was going to be my punchline, really.
But maybe you can propose some text for the feed issue, because I didn't make an attempt to.
Yeah, that's easier to unpick. As I said, the issue. So the issue with doing a PR that I ran into was just all of the references. So the bulk definition, I think everybody's been largely agreeing, at least on the major points, for a few weeks now. The editing task to do is to find all of the implications in places where it's referenced and doesn't quite tie up, and that's the detail that we've been getting from Cedric today.
Okay. That's it.
So yes, I would like to confirm that you agree on the goal there. So my view is that both John's example and Roy's examples are two instances of implementation specific registration policies. So one of them is, at least the way I would reformulate it, is passing a signed cryptographic group for the feed as part of the registration info. And the other is passing a reference or a digest of the service configuration to be used for the registering the statement. So I think both are important examples of registration policies that we don't want to standardize yet. We just want to make sure that the architecture enables both to be specified in an implementation specific way. And later on, once we know what are the most popular patterns, you may want to provide a bit more structure, like a registry or standardize some of the most commonly used registration policies. But for now, just letting each implementation defines and enforce their own registration policy is good enough. Is it correct, or do you want to write something significantly different from that?
That is correct, and the details we've been talking through, and again, to sort of reference Roy's point, my understanding of it is just to make sure that where things are referenced, we either remove that reference, which allows us to lean on this very simple non-normative approach that you're talking about, which I prefer, or if it's really hard to do that, that's where the extra thinking might need to come in about very specifically saying we make this policy evaluation based on the issuer of the signed statement, rather than the issuer of the identity of the issuer, for example, because we have sub-CA and PDP type issues with that, rather than the API identity of the thing entering the API endpoint. There's just a few little snags where we have to either remove references or make those references more specific. But overwhelmingly, yes, I agree with what you just said, and I think it's the right answer to move forward.
Okay, thanks.
Dick.
Thank you, Hannes. Yeah, I just want to go on the record as supporting what Roy said earlier, that we really just need to trust the transparency service. And I think we have real world examples of how this works today. For example, land records, which are registered here in the US by the registrars of these records, have a process they follow. And when I go to the land records registry, I trust the data that I receive. So I think trusting the data in the registry that the registry contains and provides is the way to go. And I also believe it's up to us to define the correct processes and procedures in SCITT that will ensure that the people, that the transparency services that contain these registrations are lock solid. They are impeccable integrity, and that the process and protocols that we create will ensure that. Thanks.
Okay. Great.
Yeah, hi. Good morning. So I was a little bit late. I'm for absolutely trying to make things simple, and I think we're gonna, for me anyway, I want to I want to try this stuff and see what we're gonna learn when we start trying it, because it's too much to try to think of without really trying it in, and then I'm sure we can add whatever's needed at that time. But this level of the receipts with the registry and so forth is a core to it. And in order to proceed, we need to at least get something working, and then we can improve it. So I'm for the KISS method, and any any statements I may have made to the contrary, take those with a grain of salt. I'm just trying to make sure we can support the things I'm thinking of. But thank you.
Thanks, Ray. Mitya.
Yeah, hi. No, I just, first of all, I wanted to ask a simple administrative question. So the SCITT Architecture 01 is the current draft that we are kind of looking for and submitting on Monday?
The 01 is the one that we have submitted. I will post a link to the GitHub repository into the chat window to show you like the open issues and all sorts of other stuff and PRs. And there will be another version submitted, 02, and the deadline is next Monday. So
Can we see this
the
version or how it works?
yeah, you can let me look it up.
Because the most important thing, like for me, for now, because of the time constraint, is to make sure, because in 01 draft, there was quite open to the other architectural kind of, for example, the construction of the log and so on. And as far as I understood in this current draft, we're going to make things like locked up into particular implementation, which we would definitely not like to see there. And because simply some stuff we just cannot, for example, implement in general. Like if because we already have like a blockchain service which uses particular modified binary Merkle tree. If, for example, the draft will say, okay, you will need to use this particular Merkle tree, then we won't be able to simply comply ever. So for me, this is like very important topic to make sure at least that it's quite open, so implementations are possible. And 01 architecture, I think, provides great kind of framework for that. Thanks.
That's good to hear. Yeah, you definitely. So I posted the link into the chat window, but we have been talking a lot, and there have been changes made to the document. But I would say that many of them are more cosmetic, like readability, etc., not fundamental in the way that they would totally change the way 01 works in by any stretch of imagination. So I think you should be fine, but please double check and raise those points immediately.
One that I'm looking for is draft SCITT Architecture MD 3 weeks ago, that one? Or which one of the, because there are several links there, editor's copy, data tracker page, working group draft. Which one should I look at?
Yeah, so that there's an official sort of the submitted working group draft. This is the one, 01 is the submitted one, which is also linked via that page. But if you look at the editor's copy, that's the that's kind of the current snapshot. But there are still 2 PRs in there, and I haven't added the PR of the discussion that we just had a minute ago about the registration policies, and maybe there will be other PRs coming this week, as we are sort of like editorial sort of fixes or so, because there are still a few glitches in the document, like.
So I'm looking at this one that I just posted the direct link to, right?
Let me see. No, that's wrong. You looked at the wrong direction. Yeah,
because
sorry.
that's what the editor's copy is linking to.
Oh, okay. Then sorry. Is this? Let me look. Let me click myself so then I see. Give me a second.
Or maybe the working group draft. Or...
No, you're right. Now as I click on the link myself, yeah, that's the editor's copy. That's the link that it resolves to.
Okay, so this is the correct one, or the current
yeah.
one. Okay. All right.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, and the source is also in the same directory. This is just the HTML rendered version of the Markdown source that is in that.
Of course, yeah.
Okay, so now let's Ray.
I just had one sort of detail that I found weird. The term feed is defined to mean the issuer's name for the artifact, and Is that right? I mean, or is that some sort of a, because feed to me doesn't normally mean that, but maybe within this realm of technology it does. It is a feed to me I would think would mean something that you tap onto and you start watching all kinds of stuff coming through, instead of just a name for one artifact. It's just a question.
Well, I have to defer to someone who came up with that term. I don't know who it was. Hank, you came up with that term?
Hi, this is Hank. I'm not sure if this is working.
Yes.
Well, yeah.
Okay.
So,
yeah.
Sorry.
Could you rephrase the question, including the term, please? Because I'm
okay. So
yeah.
So on section 6.1, it goes through all signed statements must include the following protected headers, and one of them is called the feed, and it's the third one down, and it says the issuer's name for the artifact is a string. So maybe, and it does, but I hear in the conversation here people talking about the feed, and I was understanding that you could have maybe several people subscribe to the feed off of the transparency service if somebody wants to just watch everything come through and verify whatever they want, as opposed to being a specific name for an artifact. So if maybe somebody who's more familiar can take a look at that section and reflect on whether that's the right term.
Okay, so the feed is a topic you could relate it to a topic of what typically is done with brokering subscription publish models, pub/sub models. So the feed here is about a product, and we acknowledge the fact that just a name for a feed might not be enough, that there might be a hierarchy here, so to speak, subtopics, as everybody in broker world realized at some point. And we might have to elaborate on the value of the feed to represent that hierarchy. So this is a subtopic regarding that product, for example, software product.
So it isn't necessarily just a name for an artifact, but the feed could contain that, or it can contain some other stuff too, right? Is that what it means?
Yes, it's associated information, of course. Easiest scenario is I have a distinguishable piece of software that I maintain, and I register statements about that software. But you could also have standard subtopics that every piece of software comes with VDRs, with I mean, that's to take up Dick's use case, or would come up with updates versus patches versus deprecation or something statements. And so there might be specific feeds, and we have to agree on a certain structure here. But for now, as that is a next iteration problem, so to speak, we will keep it simple for now on the feed level, but expect that we have to bring the topic up again and make it a little bit more complex. Same goes with the registration policies. I think always in line, so I will not talk about that too much, but there's issuers may register things. That is the minimal viable registration policies is to restrict issuers, of course. I think that is a must for the core API, but then also we might want to restrict the DID methods here. And that is, by the way, why it was at some point you said it was just a string, the issuer, because we are using the DID method here. And I think I will yield the floor for Ori to elaborate on that, hopefully not contradicting what he's going to say.
Yeah, okay, thanks for the description.
Ori.
Yep. I basically was going to say all the things that Hank said. I think, the important thing to keep in mind here is there's different ways to look at this ecosystem. You can look at it from the perspective of the transparency service and the operators of the service. The first question that they have is who is allowed to send me signed statements? And then the second question that they have is, is there any metadata in these signed statements that will be useful to, grouping things. So if I say, well, I've got these 3 providers, each of them has a unique identity, and I want to let these 3 guys submit stuff to my log, that's great. Each of them might have a different feed that they're commenting on, or they might both be interested in making comments about the same feed. And my policy as a transparency service is what determines whether I accept that. So for example, I could have a policy that says this issuer is only allowed to talk about fish. This issuer is only allowed to talk about beef. Or I might have a policy that says these issuers are allowed to talk about fish or beef, but only when they use these keys. So the policy, registration policy is big, and it sort of assumes some things are in place in order to be useful. And the most important thing the registration policy assumes is some awareness of the issuers, as Hank mentioned. That's it.
So before you go, Ori, the question is, how do you think we solve that? Like even in a feed, adding a different identity provider, you still need some hint to know something's changed. Like, I don't understand how a feed fixes this problem. And I know you and I have gone around the post on this one, but I'm trying to get clarity.
I'll jump to the front of the queue to try and answer. So the feed is just one part of the solution.
Yep.
The registration policy it could be complicated. The simplest version just says these are the issuers that I'll trust to accept signed statements from. And that by itself also doesn't really fix these problems. You need kind of more detailed policies to decide more specific business processes. In general, policies are sort of out of scope for us. The only one that we really spend a lot of time talking about is the registration policy, because it represents some of the minimal cryptographic requirements to ensure that every transparency service will have some sort of common security basis. But you can imagine, the seafood industry might have a whole set of shared policies that add on to the registration policy that protect their specific business scenarios, like, never accepting a temperature sensor, from a cold storage, vessel if it's outside of a certain range, because it would represent some liability. Like, that's very specific to the kind of information that provider might want to be anchoring, and policies will work for that, but they might not be policies we would discuss here.
Yeah, I got all that. That's the outer sort of policy discussion, but I'm still trying to figure out, when you're processing receipts, how do you know something's changed?
When you process receipts, who is
The
you?
consumers of a trusted statement are going to be processing receipts in bulk.
Okay.
So let's use the language of the spec. Let's say that I'm a consumer of software that I have transparent statements for, and your question is, how do I trust the transparent statements for the software I'm consuming?
Okay, so let's be really crisp. So in the software supply chain space, we have SBOMs that we have to build a tree for. So we got a whole bunch of SBOMs. We got a whole bunch of VEC statements and CVEs that we all have to process for every single product as we try to reference it. So there's multiple things coming in flight. If I've vetted the trust with the transparent ledger, how do I detect when the configuration is changed? If there's not a hint in all these documents that I can hang my hat on, going back and saying, here's a receipt, tell me what your policy was at the time.
You can't say changed anymore without being more precise. What do you mean? What changed?
I gave the example in the previous conversation with John, which is somebody enabled DID Web, or somebody enabled SigStore, or somebody removed those. How do I know that when I'm processing all these products, how do I know something's changed?
So you're saying, if the transparency service changed the allowed issuers, how do I know?
Correct.
Right. And there isn't a way for you to know that right now. You might, as a client, you would. So the thing is, the transparency service is always going to be giving you transparent statements that are from it. And it
Correct.
might have, like, today it supported these guys that are all great, but tomorrow they lower their standards and now everyone can send stuff. The signatures are still going to come from the transparency service. It's just that they're not really meaningful anymore because the transparency service went from being very selective to being not very selective.
Right. And that's
And
exactly.
there isn't any way in the current architecture for you to detect anything regarding that, because the trust root that the client, the consumer of the software or the consumer of the transparent statement, that's a trust relationship between them and the transparency service. And there isn't a way to sort of grade the transparency service based on what we have today. You trust
but
them.
Roy, this is not something we have documented in a way that we said that we want to solve that problem.
If you look, we put in the fact that we wanted the identity provider path to be discussed as part of this working group. As part of that, we have to think through what it means for the receipts that we generate in this form. So that's why I keep harping on. I understand what Ori is saying about the different verticals and the specific stuff, but when it comes to this, the weakening of the transparency service scares the bejesus out of me here if we don't have some way to set the alarm off pretty early.
Can you put an issue into the issue tracker so we don't forget that? And now the question to the group, 8 minutes left. Should we continue that conversation or briefly talk about the key transparency? Dick, Ray, Neil, what do you think?
I'm fine with moving to the key transparency service, but this fundamentally is when I say registration policy, it was specifically for the transparency service always. This problem specifically.
I mean, I'll just jump in and say that, you're still going to be able to see the signatures from the issuers themselves. So the consumer might see a broader range of stuff coming through a feed, but the consumer, I don't know, in my mind, the consumer isn't trusting the transparency service to be an authority on whether software is secure or whatever. It's trusting
it's relying on the transparency service to have said the identity that you use to sign past the agreed upon policy. And when the policy changes, that's where I'm really struggling.
Yeah, and I just don't think we can leverage policies to take care of everything. I think it's hard to be a relying party here, but you can have new statements that I don't know. It's not the transparency service that is vetting the content and the truth.
I never said it had anything to do, it has nothing to do with the content. It has to do with the identity providers that are configured. Do I allow?
How is this different, Roy, with other sort of services? Like you subscribe to some Microsoft service and they keep changing their privacy policy. Like as a user, you have to reevaluate the decision whether you want to use that service or not.
No, because we basically are forcing and distributing trusted routes down to everybody, either through group policy or through Windows Update or through some other. We're trying to say, hey, this is offloading a lot of that problematic. If you trust the transparency service to do this job, then knowing when somebody reconfigured it is super important.
Right. File an issue. We should at least capture it in a document, even if we sort of cannot find it.
This is what we've been talking about since the last IETF. This is exactly what I was working on in the last hackathon. This is why we created maybe the text that they're in the open issues aren't clear, but this is exactly the whole point.
I so far, like, as you know, like I've been in every discussion. I didn't, so this was for the first time you articulated it so clearly to me that I understood it. But maybe that's just me. So it was good. I learned something new. So maybe it is already well documented. We just haven't gotten to incorporate the text into the document.
That's fine. I'll go back and look at the issues again. Ori's statement is the one that scares me, which is turn it from something you trusted to something that's junk. is something we have to make sure we defend against.
Okay. Dick.
Thank you, Hannes. Yeah, this is related to the policy and the issues we're discussing. Right now, there's a debate underway inside the CISA in US DHS on software identity, how to express or how to identify software. And I think this is going to be germane to our registration policies as well, is that we need to have a unique identifier for software. If we're going to be providing software supply chain artifacts through a registry, then we need to be able to identify the specific software products that the material relates to. So I think we may need to address the need for a agreed standard for how to identify software products within a registry. Thanks.
Okay. We still have 4 minutes for the key trends. John, do you want to sort of summarize a little bit on the key trends discussion? There's currently, so I don't know if you guys are on the key trends mailing list, but there's currently a call for what is actually the call exactly, to approve the charter of the group based on the text that is has been floating around. Is that correct, John?
It is correct. I'm not the best place to talk about this necessarily. I think Ori and Dick and others have been more involved this week. But yeah, there's a birds of a feather on the Tuesday of IETF 117, and ahead of that, they're looking to get statements of support for the current draft of the spec.
Yeah, but it's definitely worthwhile to read through the specification. I think Ori, you posted it to the mailing list, to the SCITT mailing list, and it's interesting in a sense because they have obviously a specific problem they want to solve, like the storing the binding between user identities and their public keys. And they also have some specific privacy requirements, which I thought was interesting, and they solved them using BRFs, which are different than the DIX RIF, some cryptographic technique. And they also have a more elaborate API, and I think that's also interesting to look at from based on the discussion we had on the list. Henk.
Yeah, hi. This is Henk. Sorry, again, I have to put off something. Yeah, okay. I think it's very important that we do not create parallel structures that can be avoided with key trends. I think we tried to reach out a few times. That was not super successful. That is just my gut feeling. I don't know how other perceive that. I think at IETF in San Francisco, we really have to make sure to find the above proponents, champions on site and such, and or key proponents on such, and find out that we will not create non-interoperable parallel structures here. That would be the only thing I'm a little bit unsure about if that is avoidable at the moment, because I can't see anything in the charter that would disallow creating these parallel structures. Maybe it's justified. I think that's for the ISG to find out. But also we can highlight maybe a few domains where there's synergy and some other domains where we can learn from each other. And I think that's a job. I think someone has to take that on. I'm not entirely sure if we've been very good at that yet, including me.
Cedric?
Yeah, just we don't have much time, but just a couple of words. So first of all, I think the vote is only for the charter, not for a technical document or a spec. If there is a spec that it covers, then I need to read it. But I think it's just for the charter, which is quite brief and abstract. The second thing is
the current discussion is about the charter, but there is also a spec to look at, which Ori kindly posted, but I will post it again to the chat window.
Yes, so the second comment, and I think that it would be really useful to discuss with them a view of key transparency as a supply chain for public keys. And if we do that, then the similarities and what we can reuse out of SCITT and what our specific needs become more apparent. And so I think at least them expressing interest is discussing that angle with us, maybe in the chatter, maybe before the next IETF or at the next IETF meeting would be the most useful. So it is in effect a supply chain for public keys with specific requirements on privacy, but also requirements that are quite generic and close to what we are doing. The third aspect maybe is in terms of Merkle trees, their needs are a bit different from ours because they critically need labeled Merkle trees so that they can do lookups, not just proof of inclusions. And so it's possible with cozy Merkle trees, but that will require extending the scope of what we are doing there so far.
Okay, thanks, Cedric, and thanks to everyone. We ran already overtime again, and I will reach out to Steve about the document submission deadline, so he indeed submits the document, and I will create a PR for the registration policy as we discussed, and yeah. I think we have another call next Monday, so I hope you guys have time to participate in addition to the draft writing and draft updating. So we'll continue the conversation there, and maybe we'll be able to do some last minute fixes.
And Hannes, could we come to some conclusion on the hackathon, what we plan to show there?
Yeah. That's maybe something we should already start doing on the mailing list. And then we can do that also during the meeting, yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Okay, thanks. Good meeting.
Thanks, everyone.